Hi, good evening everybody. That's Luca talking. Fabio is here on the stage with me. We are both from the University of Trento, which is in the northeast of Italy, right in the middle of the Alps. There we do a lot of research with the industry, and this research with the industry is where this work stem. And we're going to talk about how the CVSS is dosing your patching policy and actually wasting your money by making you do much more work than you actually should do. And as a side note, after our talk on why vulnerability studies sucks, nothing better than another talk on vulnerability studies. So, just to present ourselves briefly, we work at the security group at the University of Trento. We coordinate and participate in a number of European projects, and these are quite broad, from cybersecurity to security enforcement. But in particular, what I want to underline here is that we work indeed a lot with the industry. We have partners like Symantec, with the S&P, the UK-US National Grid. So we do quite a lot of stuff with these guys. If you want to see more details on what we work on, go visit this link or maybe tweet me, or we can discuss anything anytime you want. So before starting, a small disclaimer for the presentation. Throughout all of it, we will make a number of medical examples to clarify some rationals or methodologies that we used in particular maybe to test the CVSS score, for example. So because at the very moment Fabio is the only doctor on stage, every time you see him wearing a white coat down there in the bottom right corner, it means that he will take on the stage and, say, proceed in a more medical fashion. So if you need to sue somebody, that's him you want. So let's start. Well, vulnerabilities, you already saw from the talk before, are quite a tricky question, and the question we are posing today is, should we worry? I mean, you know that a new vulnerability affects your software. How much concerned about your decrease in security for your assets should you be? Now, the trivial answer, and actually what should you do? The trivial answer to this question is, of course you must worry. I mean, it's a vulnerability, it is a threat, it is a potential way the attacker gets into your assets, gets control of them, so of course you have to fix it. But as Steve already showed, and as many of you already know, of course, is vulnerabilities are just too many. And the complexity of the infrastructure of deploying the vulnerabilities, the patches, supporting them, is just so overwhelming that doing it for every single vulnerability is just not feasible. So what you need is indeed a risk matrix, or something that tells you this vulnerability is dangerous, fix it immediately. This vulnerability is less dangerous, leave it for later. Now, if you ask, for example, the US government or many other governments as well, or you follow protocols like the NIST SCAP protocol, or you standards like the PCI DSS for the credit cards, what you're going to do is you're going to use the CVSS as if it was a risk matrix. Now, Steve before on stage already said that the CVSS was designed to assess the impact on the system of the vulnerability. This does not really fit with the definition of risk by itself. So this thing that you have to fix every single high CVSS vulnerability for compliance, if you're following what your government, for example, is telling you to do, may need more discussion. And for that brief introduction, I will leave it already to Fabio.
So, what is CVSS at the end of the day? It's what in the medical domain will be called a clinical test. So, you suppose you have a problem with the eye, you see double suddenly. What do? You go to the emergency room and the doctor will run you a very simple clinical test. We'll tell, look at the finger, you see one. Look at the finger on the left, you see one or two. One or two. Then, oh my God, all three directions are impacted. Confidentiality, availability, and integrity are all impacted. So it's high impact vulnerability on your software. Then you will ask, close one eyes. Do you see still double? Close the other eyes. You still double, or you only see double with two eyes. Then you'll say, oh my God, this is easy to exploit. It's up in all cases. So it's a high impact vulnerabilities. This is purely clinical expertise. There's no running of strange tool like MRI scan, like penetration testing, just clinical expertise of somebody looking at something. Now, if the same thing will happen for CVSS, then the CVSS doctor that you ask for will say, oh, this is a high impact, Then you run the SCAP protocol and tells you, oh, the SCAP protocols tell you to patch. If the doctor will be a normal doctor, he will tell you, now you go for brain surgery because you need to change your IT infrastructure and patching, and will give you brain surgery. But now, as a human, you will be very unwilling to do this, to go for brain surgery just because an expert told you that there's something very high risk. So the question we would like to know is how risk? Can we quantify this risk in some more scientific or at least informative way? So if we go back to this example of double vision, when you do this test, I found out that 42 people recovered without treatment. They just go to the hospital and come back. And then doctors do this test with statistics. So statistically, let's say they saw that this is the case. However, in some other cases, I mean, Hillary Clinton is one example, if you have also an intracranial lesion, so something in the brain gets damaged, you're not going to recover without treatment. Now, what's the equivalent of this additional test that you're going to run? Maybe it's penetration testing, maybe it's additional information like presence in exploit pack or similar things. So just a clinical test is not enough. And basically, what we would like to have is what the question below that, for instance, an information officer would like to have. Okay, now I have my security configuration manager. I have one from Symantec, one from HP, I have many of them. He tells me I have this high-level software vulnerability. I've run Metasploit. Now I find it. Now I have to decide if I want to patch it or not. I would like to know if this will decrease my risk by some percentage. And if that's the case, I may decide that the risk is worth or not. And sometimes I may decide, okay, but now if the only thing that's left is that the security configuration manager says patch it, maybe the risk will only increase by a little things like 3%. So maybe it's not worth patching. So of course here we're making an example for the doctors. They use statistics, maybe we're talking about bacteria, we're talking about viruses or illnesses. Here we're more in a different scenario. We're talking about attacks. So is this worth? And in particular, does it make sense to ask questions like risk decreased by X%? And Luca will tell about it.
So yeah, in security in general, you can find a couple of scenarios. In the first one, you are the target. Like the attacker really wants you, he wants your asset, he has maybe some information that you don't have, like a zero-day exploit, for example, that works on your particular configuration. Now, in this case, because you are the victim, you cannot do any statistics because either the guy is successful and gets control of your system or he's not. This is either 1 or 0. This is no statistics. This is just a number. So trying to answer here the question that Fabio just posed does not really make sense because really there is no population upon which to test a patching policy or patching strategy to see how much the risk for this population will decrease with that particular strategy. In the other case, you're maybe just one of the targets. And recently, actually, because the attacks we've seen also this morning in the conference, there have been quite a few very interesting talks on this topic. Many attacks now are just automated. And automated attacks are not really directed necessarily toward you. They're just directed toward a population of potentially vulnerable users. And if you happen to be in this set of targets and you're vulnerable, then you are compromised. Now, here, because there is a population of users, we can make statistics on them. And this is exactly the case on which, with this work, we're focusing. We're not focusing on black swan attacks. We're basically focusing on the general threat scenario. And to do that, we collected 4 different data sets. The first is the MVD, which we consider for the purpose of this study the universe of vulnerabilities. And here for universe, I only mean that it contains every other CVE reported in the other data sets, so the statistics don't get screwed up while matching the CVEs. Also, we eliminated all the corrupted data, the rejected vulnerabilities, the CVSS that are not there, that are not valid, and so on. This was for Steve, that is somewhere in the crowd. Then there are the Exploitability database, that is the dataset where security researchers publish proof of concept exploitation code that proves that the exploitation of the vulnerability is possible. Now note that this is not proof of the actual exploitation of the vulnerability. This only means that a proof of concept exploitation code exists for that vulnerability. The evidence for the actual exploitation is reported in the third dataset, which is SIM, in which we report CVEs that Symantec reports as actually exploited in the wild worldwide. So they have a set of sensors, of course, that are their clients, and these clients send back data to Symantec's data center. And when they find a vulnerability that is actually being exploited on the host of their client, they report it here. So here we're being conservative. In this dataset, if there is a CVE, it means that evidence for its exploitation does exist. If there is no CVE, it only means that Symantec does not have evidence for it. This may mean a number of things. For example, that Symantec is not interested commercially in putting this data there. However, if you look at how the software is distributed, vulnerable software is distributed in this dataset, you find a lot of stuff, of course, for Windows, for Microsoft Office, for browsers and Flash, Java, and so on. But there is also more other stuff for server applications like Apache or ISS. There is stuff for .NET frameworks, JDK, and so on. So it's quite varied. And at the end of the day, we think this is a good enough data set if treated properly. And you will see later in the presentation how did we handle this issue here to get something significant out of it. And then there is the fourth data set, which is a kit. It contains CVEs that are traded in the black markets as bundled in exploit kits in particular. This is a substantial expansion on Contagio's exploit pack table. And we collected it by basically monitoring more than 90 different exploit kits for a certain amount of time, about more than 1.5 years, in fact. So now, if we look at how these data sets are distributed, how do they relate one to the other? This is a map of them. This is a map of the data sets. Now, areas here are proportional to the number of vulnerabilities that belong to that area. And now, focusing only on the areas, the big thing is this is MVD. This is every CVE that we consider in our study. On the top left corner, you see EDB, which is much smaller than EDB, about 1/6 of it, in fact, at the time we sampled it. Then there is SIM, which is in the top center of the screen. You see, first of all, it's very small. These are about actually 1,000 vulnerabilities, which may not mean much, but it means that probably out of this universe sea of vulnerabilities, not many do really get exploited. But interestingly, for me at least, if you look at how it overlaps with EDB on the left, it's only for a very small fraction, which means that if a proof of concept exploitation code is there, the likelihood, observationally, of the actual exploitation in the wild doesn't look to correlate very well. And in fact, more than the greatest majority of SIM is not contained in the proof of concept exploitation code dataset, which is EDB. So it looks like the presence of a proof of concept exploitation code is not very significant here for actual exploitation. Finally, the small square in the middle, that's a kit, that's the vulnerabilities in the black markets. You see that it overlaps for the greatest majority of its surface to SIM. So if a vulnerability is in the black markets, it does look like it is going to be exploited. So maybe it does make sense to mark it as higher risk. And then we will see what the CVSS tells us about that. Now, if we focus instead on the colors, we coded in 3 different categories, the CVSS scores in different categories to the color. And the cyan color refers to low CVSS vulnerabilities. These are below 6. Medium score vulnerabilities are in between 6 and 9, and these are orange, and the red ones are above 9. Now, starting with the low CVSS score vulnerabilities, you see these are the greatest majority of NVD, more than half of it, is low score vulnerability. So it looks like there are many vulnerabilities that are not that interesting, but that's pretty much all you can say about it. With the medium score vulnerabilities, you see this is the majority of EDB. This actually overlaps with what Steve was saying before, that security researchers don't publish stuff if this is not worth it. In fact, you see that the low score vulnerabilities are basically absent. They're very little here. So security researchers basically publish most stuff for medium or some of it for high score vulnerabilities. Well, the actually central thing, and that shows the problem already from this picture, is the high CVSS score. You see that a lot of it is outside of SIM. So there are many vulnerabilities that if you followed what the US government is telling you to do, so fix high score vulnerabilities, you're going to do all this work, you're going to fix all that red, even though there is no evidence for it that it will actually get exploited. So this stuff is all work you did for no reason. But if you look at the high CVSS score into the for the vulnerabilities in the black markets, the thing already changes a bit. So it actually shows that the area that overlaps with SIM in a kits is almost completely red, which means that high CVSS score and the presence in the black markets as a cofactor, as a confounding, does look like it already increases a bit the chances of the actual exploitation. Finally, if you only look at how the CVSS is distributed in SIM, you see that, again, only half of it is covered by the red area, so only half of it is high CVSS score, so only half of it you fixed. The remaining half you missed. So actually, the picture, the message I would like you to take away from this map, that is only an observational look at our data sets, is that the CVSS looks like it's not doing a proper job in two ways. In first way, it marks at high score vulnerabilities that are not going, or that arguably may not be going to be actually exploited, which is all the red you see outside. On the other, it also fails to mark vulnerabilities that are not going to be exploited. So it fails to say, this vulnerability is not interesting, don't patch it. Because you see half of the vulnerabilities that it says don't patch were actually exploited. So at the end of the day, it looks like CVSS is kind of inaccurate with this thing, but why so? Now remember that despite the CVSS score being designed to be an assessment of the impact of the vulnerability on the system, you're using it, if you're following the US government and the SCAP and so on, as if it was a risk metric. Now, a typical risk assessment is made about a simple product, which is the impact of a particular event times the likelihood of that event happening. Now, if you look at how the CVSS-based score is designed, and the CVSS-based score is what every standard tells you to use, not the temporal metric and the environmental metric, just the base score, this is very, very similar. There is the impact of the vulnerability times another factor, which is the exploitability, that in this case, if you're using it as a risk metric, does play the role of the likelihood in the computation of the risk. But if you look at how it is distributed in the data sets, the exploitability score, here it is reported, it goes from 0 to 10, that's on the x-axis, and on the y-axis there is the frequency of that particular score for each data set. You see that it is not even a variable, it's just basically a constant. So everything is exploitable, which means that everything has the same risk according to the CVSS score as a risk metric. I cannot stress this enough. So basically the impact is the only real measure. So CVSS is not estimating the risk because it marks everything as equally risky. Not necessarily equally risky, but it lacks half of the metric. Now, if I myself was in the crowd, and I'm sure that most of you are actually thinking this now, I would be like, I don't really agree. No, I don't agree with your numbers because you're saying you're comparing data sets without controlling for other factors, like you're just maybe comparing apples and oranges, right? Maybe MVD contains stuff for very old vulnerabilities that are not included in a semantic data set because they're just too old and there is no more exploits in the wild for this. So it doesn't mean that they were not exploited, it just means that at the moment of the detection of semantic, these were not included. Or maybe that EDB contains a lot of software entries that are of no commercial interest for Symantec. So, and actually this is true. I mean, if you look at the software entries in EDB, only about 300 are in both. So only 300 are, like, for example, software like Internet Explorer and Firefox are in both. But stuff like Joomla extensions, stuff like this is typically only in EDB. So of course you cannot really do statistics, but only looking at the map that I showed you here. This map is not enough to give the real picture, the complete picture. So we need something more precise. And this is what Fabio is going to tell you now.
So if you want to run something more scientific, so to speak, you will have to likely do a controlled experiment. You ask some people to take a software with lots of vulnerability, you put them in the wild. You ask people to take a software with all the patches, you put them in the wild, but you cannot ask somebody to say, hey, take Internet Explorer version 6, run for 2 years and have your bank account being emptied and maybe your identity being stolen. You cannot just do it. So you need something different. So you cannot run a controlled experiment. And the doctor, fortunately for us, they already know these things because you cannot ask somebody to smoke so you can test whether smoking produces cancer. So what you do what is called a case control study. And that's what we have done. So what a case is simply a person with lung cancer, which in our case will correspond to an exploited vulnerability according to Symantec Global Intelligence Network. And then you look for other variables, other features of this case. Like for people, you will look to age, sex, social status, or location, things that may explain the problem. Like in the original cancer case, they were thinking that location, living in London, was, because of the pollution, was the case of lung cancer. And then you look at what is your worry, like the smoking habits, which in our case will be the CVSS score. And for each of the cases, you take randomly another person, which is the same variable of the control variables. This is why that's called a control study. Right? Every case, every exploited vulnerability has a corresponding control. And then you want to look at the control. To make it a bit more clear, let's see really the comparison side by side. On one side, they had the lung cancer, and here you look to the same hospital patient. So you can offset for some things that you may not want to measure. Then you look for people with the same age, the same sex, and coming from the same location, for instance. And then you look at exploited vulnerabilities, this is the case, and for each of them you look to the same kind of vulnerabilities, and they will be your control. And then you look to the same thing, like confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You want to make sure that they have the same impact. Why? Because you want to make sure that you don't confuse skin cancer and lung cancer. It doesn't make sense to compare vulnerability with a high impact in confidentiality, but maybe no impact on integrity, with a vulnerability that only impacts integrity. And then this is your controls, and for this you look back, what is the CVSS score of this control? Is this control vulnerability in the exploit databases, so maybe it's Metasploit? Or isn't this vulnerability in the exploit kits? So maybe the bad guys are doing something with it. So let's see an example. So just to make it a bit clearer. So we take a very simple vulnerability, which is used after free in Microsoft Internet Explorer. So this was discovered or disclosed in 2010. It has a certain impact for both confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And the vendor and the software are well defined. Now, what is the control? We need to select randomly one control among the one in ECADS for in the exploit packs vulnerabilities that have the same feature. In the exploit kits, we have only 5 instances to randomly choose one, and in the exploit database, only 7. And in NVD, there are 37 samples that could come in. So we repeat this process for every vulnerability that's reported in Symantec Threat Explorer. We find one randomly in the corresponding data set to act as a control. And then for this control vulnerability, we look back. Is it high score? Is it low score? Is this actually an exploited vulnerability by any chance? So we get back to SIM. We pick something from SIM, and each time we pick something with the same characteristic, it's always back in SIM. It's important that the software is the same, because we don't want to compare obscure software like the plugin to Joomla to something that's like an Internet Explorer. So after you have done this, what do you look for? Which is the metrics that makes interested company-wise. Again, in this case, we are also happy because the doctors already identified. I mean, there's two of them. One that mostly security researchers focus on is sensitivity, which maybe you don't know with this name, but basically what you want to know, or sometimes false negative, false positive. So what you look for is the true positive versus the sick people. So you want to make sure that your metric is good in identifying the vulnerability that are going to be exploited, the dangerous one. So if sensitivity is very high, this means that the test correctly identify exploited vulnerabilities. If this is low, this means it's not flagging sick people enough. So this means there's a lot of dangerous vulnerability that later on will be discovered in the wild. Sorry, not discovered, that will be exploited in the wild, and they will be undetected. You don't want that. However, if you're working as a CIO, there's also something that's also very important, that is money. You don't have an unbounded budget. So you would like to possibly to make sure that you don't spend money for fixing something that don't need fixing. So that's specificity come into play. Specificity is the true negatives versus all healthy people. So it's the vulnerability that they're not going to be exploited in the wild. Yes, there's published somewhere. Maybe some hostile foreign government may use to spy on you, but they may also use spear phishing. So they're really the things that is not going to be found when you track the information on the wild that's really happening on the network. If it's high, specificity is high, it's good. This means if you're not going to be exploited, the test will mark you correctly. If it's low, it's bad because it's generate lots of panic in the people because you tell healthy people, oh, you need brain surgery, please go. So our CVSS score, once we have done this data sampling and then we use it as a control study. So unfortunately, it's sort of a generate panic test. So remember, sensitivity tell us is if you get a high CVSS score, is this a good market for exploitation in the wild? And specificity tell us is low CVSS score a good market for not exploitation? Because that's what you want to know. You would like to know if I get a low, I'm happy, don't have to do anything, don't have to worry. If it's high, I would like to know, okay, I have to worry because there is an exploitation, not just because somebody puts me pressure. And let's look at the first row in the table. The first row in the table is the, let's say, the dump policy. The policy that says, I know there's a vulnerability, I don't even want to know which is CVSS score is, I'm going to patch it. So it's completely stupid. And you see there, you get a very high sensitivity because essentially you're patching everything. You're overprotecting yourself, but specificity is very low, it's 0%. Now, if we look at what is just CVSS high and medium score is doing, you see that sensitivity is still very high, but specificity is not improving, it's only improving to 23%. So what does it mean? Statistic is always very difficult to perceive. So this means that if you patch 4 vulnerability, 3 out of 4 were a mistake, were something that were not going to be exploited, was false alarm. Things seem to improve a bit for proof of concept exploit in exploit databases. So this means if you have something on Metasploit, the sensitivity will increase again, 97%, but specificity is still very low. So this means it's not, again, a bit more than 3 out of 4, it's wrong effort. And the third line, instead, if you look what the exploit packs are doing, what the bad guys are marketing in their forums, so good exploiting products, you see the specificity increases. So this means if it's low, it's probably not going to appear in the wild. And sensitivity is also very high. Just to put this into perspective, to see how far security researchers still to go to compare with the medical profession, that we listed them 2 of the most popular, well-known medical tests. One is the triple blood test, which is a simple blood exam that you run for pregnant women when they are over 40, when they have a child, to avoid to check whether they risk that the child has a Down syndrome, which is a serious mental handicap. You see the specificity is 95%. That's what you would like as a CIO. You would like to say, okay, this score says low, I don't have to worry. Of course, you may still have, as in the triple blood test, a wrong child or a handicapped child. It's an unfortunate event. But in most of the cases, you can rely on it. Sensitivity instead is not so good, but it's still good enough for you to flag most of the things. For males, maybe the last line is more interesting. That's prostate cancer test. Again, is a blood test. It's very simple of antibodies. And you see again the specificity is 90%. So this means that security researchers still have to go a long way. I mean, the CVSS as a test is not good enough, and we have some good indicator like the kits, some not so good indicator like proof of concept or things that penetrator tests will find. But what really happens if we plug this information in a patching schedule, if we plug these numbers in a patching schedule? And Luca will tell you about it.
So, thanks, Fabio. Now, let's remember you're patching here with this. We assume that you're patching high and medium score vulnerabilities, and also assume that you're considering the cost of patching linear with the number of vulnerabilities. Now, remember that specificity 22%. It means that 4 out of 4 vulnerabilities that are not going to be exploited, you did patch 3. So you're spending 3 times more effort, 3 times more money, 3 times more time than you probably should. But this is, this comes from the performance of the test. This is an a priori probability. This is an a priori consideration. What happens though when you plug this test into an actual patching policy? What happens when you allow the test to propagate the error to many vulnerabilities? Now let's remember a few numbers and see what comes up. Remember you're patching high and medium scores. Sensitivity tells you out of the vulnerabilities you should have patched how many you did. How many though have the high and medium score, and this is 90%. Not the opposite, but the complementary of the specificity tells you how many of those that you shouldn't have, you should not have patched, you did patch anyway, because they were, again, flagged high and medium. And this is the 3/4 at the top of the slide, so it's 77%. Now, if you compute the probability, the conditional probability that once you patched, you would have avoided an attack, that's Bayes' theorem and so on, and when it turns out that out of 10 vulnerabilities you have patched, 9 you could have avoided. So it's 9 times more effort than it should be. Now, maybe it's a bit hard to see right out from the text, so let's try to see how it works. Let's try to visualize it. So this is a sample from the control study. So these are vulnerabilities that are representative of what Symantec does detect. In a typical sample, there are about 4% of vulnerabilities that are actually included in SIM. So despite the control study, the number of actually exploited vulnerabilities is rather low. Now, of this, 90% you did fix, because this is what sensitivity tells you. Of those that are actually going to be attacked, you fixed 90%. These are the red dots you see here. Now, remember that 1 minus the specificity tells you how many of the remaining vulnerabilities you still patched. And this is all the green you see here, which is 95% of the work you did. So 95% of the work you did, no reason to do it, no evidence at least for you to compel with all this work. It looks like CVSS as a risk matrix, it's hardly deployable, but still the CEO, the CIO, should do something. So maybe we can still give him some sort of constructive advice. And this is what Fabio is going to introduce you now.
So, just this is the conclusion, because we know that at 5:30 they are starting the free beer, so we want to hold you much longer and give you the time to go for it. So let's come to a very simple mitigation strategy that each of you is using every day. So should you wear a seatbelt or not? So this is a very simple question. And of course, what you like to know in terms of this question is the probability of dying with the seatbelt on is any better than the probability of dying with the seatbelt off. Notice that you can still die. And this is important to also consider when you consider security decision. There's no guarantee that making a decision will not make you hackable in any sense. You can still die, or your IT infrastructure can still be hacked. So here, when you compare these differences for safety belt, the answer is yes. If you wear a safety belt, you can have 40%, over 40% chances of survival. So again, you can still die in a car crash if you wear a safety belt on. If a truck runs over you, you have no chances. But still, you're better off with it than without it. And now, with this, the same things can be done for the CVSS scoring, and Luca will explain it.
So here, wearing the seatbelt is the equivalent of patching, right? Is your strategy to reduce your risk of dying in a car accident, as much as patching is a strategy to reduce your risk of being compromised, whether if you were attacked by an attacker. So what it ends up is that a strategy, patching policy, a patching oh, come on, right now? Really? Seriously? That was just the culprit. So with CVSS, if you're patching high and medium score CVSS scores and you have evidence that this vulnerability is in the black markets, you should really buckle up, because this is a decreasing risk of 62%. This is arguably a good investment. It's actually better than wearing a seatbelt. So you should really do. 62% is a good number. Looks like it's worth it. If you only have evidence of a proof of concept exploitation code and you have a high and medium score vulnerability that affect your system, the decreasing risk goes down to about 20%. This really depends on you. Maybe you have the resources, maybe you have the time, maybe you are risk prone and you just want to deploy all the patches anyway. Okay, it's up to you. Can still be worth it. The sad note is if you're only using high and medium score vulnerabilities to patch, these will give you a reduction in risk of only 3%, which means that you will avoid only 3% of the attacks more if you patch all the red that you see in the map at the beginning. Well, maybe life is too short for that. So guys, if you're doing that, CVSS needs to improve in this sense to match this expectation, to be your seatbelt. And this actually concludes the talk. If you have any question, we're right on time. Anybody?
Yeah, go ahead. Either shout. Okay, I will answer to this because one of the logo there of this project, ST from this economics project, which is a project we have with National Grid, which is the largest UK operator that make power transmission. And in the UK, in the northeast of the US, they also monitor oil and gas. And they really are, let's say, they don't like too much the US policy in this area because the US policy is regulatory compliance. That says you have to do this and this and that, follow a checklist. The UK instead is more on risk-based, so they would like to force it, for example, force them to patch based on the number. And so they really are one of the people filing this project because they want to see, or at least have strong evidence that sometimes the regulatory compliance is not a good thing to do because it's forcing them to spend too much money, which then ripples off on the customer. Like they have to pay higher fee for the electricity bill or the oil and gas bill with respect to others. So that's why it's a regulatory compliance may be less for liabilities because then you have the tick box all filled in, you are happy, nobody can sue you. But from the point of view of investment, it may be not a good thing. So that's why it's the decision for safety belt was a governmental decision. And this was backed up by the 42% study, while the CVS decision is not backed up by other numbers. And at least when we did this study, it shows up as not a good number in the general sense. So it may be more by fear than by rational decision. I think that's the one I end over there.
Have you considered applying your analytical skills to security measures that were put in place after September 9/11, presented to the NSA general earlier today?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it will be interesting, but we'll need to have the data. And on 54 samples that was generally show it up, it's too small number to make any statistics.
The data is classified.
On the classified, well, anything can happen.
So I don't know if you covered it. I didn't see it in the slides about the factors that you're rolling into the cost of deploying those patches. But is your analysis based on an assumption that the cost to deploy each patch is equal?
Yeah, to do that, I mean, as a simplifying assumption, we assume that it is linear. It's proportional to the number of vulnerabilities linearly. This is very optimistic. As far as I know, it's much more costly to not only just for the human cost of doing it. So we assume the least, the very lower bound.
So this is let's say a different problem, because what happens if you can only patch in batches? That's what you're saying. So I have all 4 at once or none at once. And basically may decide that the 3 additional one may be better off than 0. And for this is a study we have not done. So what happens if you have only batches? So you can only have to choose between disabling, for example, Microsoft Patch Tuesday, you should just click the box, don't patch it, anything, or a different thing. So we have not analyzed what happens in this case, if the number still works. Because this would be a different study. It's called shock analysis, but we have not done it.
Actually, if I can add something here, this is actually an open question. I mean, what you said is very interesting because that would change the sampling. So here, when Fabio made the example here, there is a Here, this vulnerability covers Internet Explorer 6, 7, and 8. If you have one patch for all 3 softwares that is deployed by Microsoft, this is one entry in the sample. This is one case. If you have 3 different patches, these are 3 cases. So you are right. I mean, it does change the numbers, but our assumption here is this.
Go ahead.
So your cost only considers the cost to deploy. If it's only 20% improvement for all high and medium, what if the impacts of the vulnerabilities we didn't patch is significantly larger than any of the costs to deploy those patches? Is that, maybe that's something for further study, but it seems like that you've got to compare that against the possible impact of the ones you missed, versus the cost to deploy. It's a more important factor, I would think.
I think the cost of a miss, it should be, let's say, it's a different variables that should be considered separately. But when we consider, let me go here. Yeah. So when we consider the affected software, that's essentially saying, okay, like in this example, there's no difference from your perspective. Once Internet Explorer is hacked, it's Internet Explorer that is being hacked. So since it's using the same condition, there should not be a difference whether they exploit one vulnerability or another.
Okay.
So this should be neutral to the impact. That's why it's important in the study to say we only try to make things that are similar.
Okay.
Because if you hack Internet Explorer, it doesn't matter if it's for X or Y vulnerability. It's always Internet Explorer that is being hacked.
But you're still suggesting that we don't patch certain high and medium vulnerabilities.
It's yeah.
It's still an open hole.
Luca told me that you can sue me. So yeah, I think that's the reasonable thing to say is that if your only, let's say, marker is the CVSS score,
Okay.
that's a bad judgment. But as for example, as we said here, as at the end, let me go over it quickly. So for example, this means that if you have a vulnerability, if you look at the immediate line, right? So this means you have one clinical test, expertise test that says CVSS score is high or medium. And for instance, the vulnerability is in Metasploit. So this means that there's a publicly available proof of concept, and your risk decreases by 20%, so it's much better. So this means simply that you need to have more information that not just, oh, it's a configuration manager that says it's high. If there's only this, you risk losing your money.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Well, I appeal to the Greek idea of the unknown God. And that is, of course, there are exploits out there that are not cataloged or not reported. So that's some small statistical problem. But we're also faced with a lot of times for large corporations waiting around for an exploit to come out. In this case, you're already way behind at that point. It may not be out already. It may show up later. That sort of thing will be reported later. So reporting bias is in there as well. Just a couple of comments.
So the let's say you raise two issues, and let me take them separately. So of course there are lots of things that are not reported, right? But for instance, we use Symantec as one sample, but maybe Kaspersky is different, or McAfee is different, or maybe the information that Citibank has is different again. But the important thing is try to make the control so that in another way that the study works. And the same in the smoking cancer study that we look at it, they only did the study on England. And this was general enough to make the conclusion also applicable to people in the United States or in China. So that's why I'm not so worried about that the conclusion, it may work for other data sets. For the vulnerability to come, I mean, of course, but as we said, we have no real answer for the black swan. Mm-hmm. And this has to be done on a completely different scenarios or say criteria. If you're worried about the black swan, then you need different techniques or different ideas. You cannot use statistics.
Thank you.
So CVSS, you've been looking at the CVSS base score as part of your analysis. But there are actually three components of CVSS scores, one of which is CVSS temporal scores that actually tell you whether a vulnerability is just known about, or whether there's patches, or whether it's being exploited, or whatever. Did you think of actually including that in your research to see whether that gives you more accurate numbers in terms of deciding whether to patch?
Yeah, no, we are here referring to what the standards tell you, and the standards tell you, for example, if you take the NIST-SCAP protocol, it tells you take the CVSS base score and you use it. The point is that the other scores, the temporal score and the environmental scores, are very expensive to compute. So it would be unrealistic. I mean, it would be interesting to check how the things change with the temporal, but the reality is that nobody really computes it because it's just... there is too much effort to put into it. There are too many vulnerabilities, and you need to have a group of experts only to compute the new score with the temporal metric. So everybody is using the base score. And actually, this is what the standards are telling you to do. So this is what we referred with the study. But of course, it will be interesting to see how the things change, if possible.
Well, it seems like you've done a lot of the work to calculate the temporal score, because you've looked at whether these vulnerabilities are in exploit kits, for example. So, I mean, you're pretty much most of the way there to calculating a temporal, and therefore you're in a good position to go a little bit further than you have done and actually modify the base score with temporal and just see what you end up with.
Now, let me answer this to the temporal question, because it's in other studies that we have done, for instance, on browsers and so on, I believe that the temporal information that we have available in the MVD or in the other database is absolutely not reliable. So you don't want to build any statistics or any evidence based on the fact that the vulnerability is disclosed at day 1 or day 2 or 1 month. You have seen the previous talk in the session. That's actually have been saying the same thing. So temporal information is very unreliable. And as an anecdote, we have done a study, for instance, on Chrome, and we find out that, for instance, the MVD will say, oh, this thing applies to N version 20 to 1. We look at the code, and the code at a certain point disappears. So if there's no code responsible for the vulnerability, you can understand that there's no vulnerability in the software because the code is not there. So I wouldn't do any statistic based on what's the data of disclosure and so on. You can have some very rough number by year. But then it's the temporal score becomes completely useless. So the only thing that makes difference is existence. The thing that will be interesting will be to know the numbers. Maybe not, actually we have some numbers, but that's still in the process of processing. The same vulnerability is not exploited the same number of times. You don't find the same number of exploits. Some vulnerabilities are exploited for millions of times, so you will find millions of attempted exploits, and other vulnerabilities for thousands. So this will be a more interesting metrics to consider. So how many exploits you find in the wild, not just the existence. Here we're only working on existence, but the number might be more interesting. Rather than, this could be a sort of environmental metrics that's more interesting than just the temporal information. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to go ahead. I mean, we have time, we still have 5 minutes time, so go ahead.
What's your solution? And have you communicated with your proposed solution that they have to the CVSS working group to fix the problem, just planning the problem?
Well, I think in some cases you see there is some solution that you need to have consider additional information in the CVSS. That's one will be to say what else is there as information, not only the individual assessment of vulnerability. But for this, we'll need to think more, and I think we have some ideas, and then we'll communicate this to the CVSS working group in the future. But now I don't like to have I can invent, of course, a solution for on the spot to propose it, but that will not be very nice and not be very effective as well. I don't know if this makes you happy, probably not.
Normally, part of this nature, here's a problem, and you have a solution, so I'm waiting for the FUD, call here.
That is not solution yet.
I find it curious that if you do have solutions to a problem, to what is now an international de facto standard, how do you communicate with the bodies that are responsible for paying this standard and possibly helping to improve the standard to the point where it does take them in which you think needs to be acted?
Yeah, no, but that's what we plan to do. Go ahead.
But anyway, we are in touch with the people for the CVSS 3 and so on. I mean, we will hopefully I don't know if we will collaborate, but we will give feedback surely with and actually other ideas that are roaming around, say in the offices in Trento. We are trying to test them, and we will come back to the community later on when we will have concrete results. Now it's more of a gut feeling, but we do have some ideas to help fixing that likelihood problem in particular.
The timing is right, but timing is also of the essence because CVSS version 3 is being worked on now.
Yeah, it is.
So this is good timing to bring in these kind of considerations.
Yeah, we're in touch with SET.
Okay, I think if there's no more question, we want to hold. Oh, go ahead.
How much work did go into collecting the data, specifically tying the CVS vulnerabilities against the exploit hits and so on and so forth? Is that something that is realistic for enterprise to do?
Well, it is feasible. I mean, at the University of Trento, we're doing it. It costed me a few months of my PhD to put the things together, but now the infrastructure is up and running, and it does not take much to update the data sets. So, of course, you have to put some effort at the beginning, but after a while, I mean, it's not that hard after all.
Let me add something. There is a trick because you need to know Russian. for some of the exploit kit. So Luca is telling Russian. I had Russian students for some point, Russian interns, to do this work. If you don't know Russian, then you may have a problem in extracting the information from the exploit kit forums and so on. So that's a bit a trick that you need to know. I think.
You talked about continuity of data sets, and one of your main sources is NVD. Did you take into consideration at all about the fact that NVD often is not used for the vendor score, and they will default to 10.0 if they can't determine from the public information that they think it's the same. So NVD often will overrate vulnerabilities and disagree with the vendors. So,
Yeah, no, but this is the data that comes out of the data sets that are publicly used and that CIO that needs to fix this vulnerability is going to look at. So the study wants to be a reflection of this. Then the data has problems. Steve said that before, but still this is the data that is being used as much as the risk score is being used as a risk score, even if it is not. This is just the state of things as they are now. So we just wanted to reproduce this problem. Then, of course, the data has a lot of problems. We tried to mitigate a lot of the things that also Steve said before. That so the NVD, we took out all the rejected vulnerabilities. We took out the invalid CVSS scores that were reported. Many are NA or stuff like that. We did control for the data bit, but still, this data set is what is out there and what is widely used. So we wanted to reproduce that.
I think our proctor is signing that we are close to the end. So thank you all of you for coming and for your questions.